Thank you, Chandrama. A very good morning to all of you. Professor Vijay Rao, Honorable Vice Chancellor, University of Hyderabad. Professor R. Vijay, Dean, School of Economics. Professor Abhiroop Mukhopadhyay, our distinguished speaker of the day. Colleagues, guests, and my dear students. The School of Economics welcomes you all to this distinguished lecture. We are delighted to have Professor Vijay Rao as the chairperson for today's lecture. Professor Vijay Rao, our beloved Vice Chancellor, University of Hyderabad, served as Senior Professor, Chair of Biology, Dean Faculty at the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research, Tirupati, Andhra Pradesh. He was associated with the Biology Department at Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Mumbai for about 24 years and served as Senior Professor and Chair of the Biology Program before moving to ISER Tirupati in 2018. Professor Rao is a PhD from the Indian Institute of Science, Bengaluru, and he worked as a research scientist at Yale University Medical School before joining TIFR Mumbai. Professor Rao is a fellow of all three national academies in India, Sir J.C. Bose Award from the Department of Science and Technology. He has made fundamental contributions in the areas of genome biology and cellular regulations and adaptations, where he published about 160 peer-reviewed international publications with high citations and impact. His publications range from experimental to theoretical biology to chemistry and physics. A person of ideas, Professor Rao's passion has been reaching the young minds. And we always find Professor Rao speaking on a variety of subjects. In fact, I had the opportunity of listening to him in ICFAI's Wise View Leadership Program, where the title of the talk was How to Make Ourselves Interesting. So I thought, there are a lot of first-year students, so we should also know our Vice Chancellor. Thank you, Professor Rao. Dr. Abhiroop Mukhopadhyay is a professor at the Economics and Planning Unit, Indian Statistical Institute, Delhi. He holds a PhD from Pennsylvania State University and is a development economist of repute. Abhiroop's specialization in econometric methods applied to education in developing countries, particularly India. His recent research interests include the impact of improved school infrastructure on rural school attendance, the design of teacher transfer programs, and the influence of human capital distribution on growth and development. Dr. Mukhopadhyay's work also addresses public policy issues, notably the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, examining its implementation's political economy and its effect on education and borrowing. Abhiroop has published in high-impact journals. He has several honors and awards to his credit, including IZA Bond Fellowship, Sir Ratan Tata Fellowship, Holmes Postdoctoral Fellowship, honorary research positions at Global Labour Organization, University of Carlos Madrid, and University of Connecticut, just to name a few. So let's welcome the chairperson and the chief distinguished speaker of the day with a big round of applause. And I now hand over the session to our chairperson, Professor Vijay Rao.
I just asked him what is the meaning of the word Abhiroop. And Abhiroop means very beautiful. It is not just the roop. And the area that he covers are also very, very beautiful and extremely relevant for the country. So I want to formally invite Abhiroop. I'll just call him Abhiroop to this beautiful university and to this very interesting and enlightened audience in economics. And I'm sure your presence here will do a lot of good to them because you bring such areas. We are we've just begun celebrating Golden Jubilee year of University of Hyderabad by celebrating knowledge, essentially. We invite people and we ask them to tell us about interesting things. I think life is interesting and it can be made more interesting by people like you. So therefore, this event is essentially to hear you talk about human capital in India, lenses old and new. Very nice, old and new lenses. So I think we are all ears for your talk. My only request to young audience here is to ensure that you ask him tough questions. It is very important to ask tough questions to tough speakers. Because then that amplifies the learning process. There is no learning without asking tough questions. Fundamental questions. That actually makes it very, very enlightening and very useful. You don't have to remember anything. You actually internalize when you ask tough questions. The answers get internalized. And that will be very useful for you in future. So our agenda is very simple. Just listen to Abhiroop and take the insights from him. I'm going to be just an audience as you speak, and I also will have some questions later. Although I'm not an economist, but I have enough bandwidth that I can ask questions. So thank you, Abhiroop, for coming by. You are here for some more time?
No, I was here for 3 days already.
3 days. Have you interacted with enough people? Lot of students. Okay, very, very good. Very good. Generally, distinguished speakers come the same day, give a talk and fly off. That's not a good model. Call the distinguished speaker 2-3 days ahead, which is what you have done. And ensure that you get the best from him or her, which you have done, which is very good. So I think this is called Paisa Vasool in Maharashtra. This is a good word. Economically very sensible word. So पैसा वसूल तो हो गया, हम भी बैठेंगे, अब सुनेंगे. So Abhiroop, धन्यवाद for coming here, and it's a beautiful, it's really lovely hall. I really like this hall best in the campus because it is compact. It is C.V. Raman watching us, watching it with piercing eyes, and this hall has his best blessings. So thank you very much. I will go down there and sit now. Yeah. Thank you very much, sir. I don't have too much to say here. I'm a good student of economics. Thank you.
I'll just take a few minutes. What I'm trying to do is I want to say that the economics department is also a very interesting place. And we have done very interesting work. So I'm just trying to tell what is it that is there. So but first of all, good morning to everyone. I welcome Professor B.J. Rao, who was very busy and he could give his time to come and spend some time and chair here. Professor Abhiroop, who came in 3 days back, we organized a workshop for the MA students. So he was introducing cross-sectional econometrics for 3 days. He had morning sessions, afternoon, one of his students who is here presented what type of tools to be used. So in that sense, we had an interesting 3-day period in the department, and a lot of students liked it because generally what happens is when starts a 3-day workshop, by the 3rd day diminishing returns set in, you don't get people. Suddenly when I see that the whole audience, the thing is full, people are there. So there looks to be an interest that is there. So in one sense, thanks for coming and spending some time with our students. I just want to tell a few minutes if I don't want to say much. One of the things about the Department of School of Economics is that we are a heterodox school. I think there's only a heterodox school that exists in India, where we teach with same rigor what is called classical systems, Marxism, as well as neoclassical. So in that sense, we are an heterodox school trying to present the students with different opinions, asking them students to make their own choice of what type of tool of analysis. And we have a fascinating large set of tools that I call tool papers. We have game theory, econometrics, many stuff that we introduce to students. So we find lots of demand that exists in that part. Our faculty also is very diversified. So we have so many optionals based on our diversified portfolios that we have. And so I think it's an interesting department which has an importance of heterodox school. Right? I will not tell many other things. I'll leave it to you. Thanks for coming. That last, I just wanted to make one point which I've been seeing, because whenever I go for any seminars or conferences or for a university, first time I see that University of Hyderabad students or anyone always is there in every page that I see. I think that is one of the greatest contributions that as a school of economics we have done. We have our people everywhere. So in that sense, we all appreciate it. Thank you for coming. Hope you come back some other time. And a lot of faculty are also asking that maybe we also should be introduced to some amount of cross-section economics. Thank you again.
So, good morning to everyone. Let me start off by first thanking Professor B.J. Rao, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Arvijay, Dean Debashish Acharya, who's kindly invited me, and the students and assistant professors who listened for 3 days on me going on and on. So I hope that it was compensated with some learning, and it's a pleasure to be here. The university is truly beautiful, and the environment is very stimulating. So it's very nice to be here, and I hope to come back again in the future. So the talk today, actually, it's interesting. It touches on many things, and it's in some sense very nice that it's happening in the C.V. Raman room, because you will see that as I go and I discuss various topics on which I worked and I know something, that, you know, while I'm an economist, the issue of human capital, largely education, and its connection to the economy, is now not a simple matter of just asking ki padha likha paisa kamata hai ki nahi, right? The word padha likha itself has many meanings, and it's very interesting that the Vice Chancellor did give a talk on how to make yourself interesting, because as you will see that the new lenses now actually have different definitions of what being educated means. Okay, um, so so the one, if I can say, disclaimer I would say is that uh, I am not here to postulate a bigger, grander theory of human capital and its link to economy. I'm an experimentalist in the language of sciences. It's my job to kind of try to give you facts, and while of course I'm aware that what you look at is influenced by the gharana you belong to, uh, you can take the same facts and construct your grand theory. So whether it's an heterodox school or it's not, or a neoclassical school, I don't think really matters. You can take my results and you can postulate your own stories around them. Okay, but the facts are what you should look at, and you should see if you can believe them or not. Okay, so with that, I'll start. Let's see, view. It's full screen, right? Usually it's Control L. Can I just? Yeah, you can sometimes you can't see. Yep, sorry. Great. Okay, thank you. All right. So you know, when people talk about Indian education generally, it's a rather dismal story, to be honest. And we are typically lamenting about what a graph like that shows, which is just a way to tell you that, you know, about only 40% of people in rural India, for example, can read, and only 25% can do divisions, right? And if you can kind of see those lines are uh, well, more or less stable. If you can say they're even coming down over time, so it's getting worse. So there is a, you know, a lot of discussions when you enter ministries, you talk to NGOs, you talk to teachers. It's kind of a dismal story of, you know, what should we do? We are kind of imploding. Um, and so in line with that, you know, the idea is always that what should we do to learning levels of Indian children? You know, there is this idea that for some reason the public sector is failing. Um, and so if you talk to people who work on the economics of education, there is a lot of emphasis on trying to understand what are the kind of interventions required to raise levels of learning to improve, test scores are one dimension of that. And then, we are trying out, and Andhra is actually, undivided Andhra was actually quite an important part of the story in trying out various incentive structures in public schools, how to increase institutional capacity. Perhaps we should give up on public sector altogether, give vouchers to people to study in private schools. Maybe we should try out some technology, maybe some pedagogy. So there are all these things that people have talked about and tried. Um, Suffice it to say that while they have worked at small scales, they have not seen spectacular success at larger scales. Okay? And so this is not to say that these are not important, but so it goes without saying that we need to do all these things in some sense to increase human capability, to foster productivity and growth. So there has to be something about quality of our learning. But as I say, life is what happens to us while we are making other plans. So you can think about all these interventions, all these other things, but it's not that the education sector in India and how it connects to the economy is a static one which is not changing over time, right? And in my talk today, I'll talk about various lenses to look at the dynamics of what's happening in the Indian education sector and the way it links up to the economy. Um, I'll try to be general, but I'm also aware that there is a section of this audience who are young scholars. So I will also throw out some kind of technical challenges in some of these issues. I think those are all open for further research. So do pardon me, some of you, if you see some regression tables once in a while here and there. I will explain them in words. They are not supposed to be very technical. But it's important for young scholars to realize the kind of challenges we face in answering some of the questions. Uh, of course, the talk is about India, so I will talk more about India. And then for those who are interested in this larger kind of story of what is happening, I will try to throw some of these results in a broader kind of economic theory of structural transformation, and what are the processes that we are seeing in a country like India. Okay, so these are old lenses. These are lenses that we have used to think about education as a dimension of human capital for many years. Okay, uh, then after having spent some time on that, I'll talk about things that what does interesting mean. Uh, since I'm in a science kind of block, I'll talk about scientific temperament. I'll talk about whether these can be taught in school. Uh, I'll talk about experiments that try to do so, right? And then I'll talk about how do we deliver them at scale. Okay? So issues which link up to different dimensions of human capital. So let's start off with the old lens. And when we people talk about how static and stagnant Indian education is, they fail to recognize uh, the great progress that we have made, at least in sending people to universities and schools. Okay, this is not a trivial one. This is actually, if you look at developing countries all over the world, you will realize that India is fairly special in that we have managed to increase or decrease illiteracy rates from 72% to almost 33%, and this is old data, and it's even lower now. And quite significantly, we have been able to raise our university completion rates from 1.1% in the 1970s to almost 11% in 2018, and more recent data shows even higher rises. So this is not to be scoffed at. Okay, yeah, we can ask ourselves what are we teaching and so on and so forth, but we have made progress in sending people to institutions. So the question is, all of us are a little apprehensive about what people are learning in universities, in schools. So the first question I would like to ask, and I would ask like you to ask yourself, is that does this kind of human capital growth, okay, lead to economic development and growth? Okay. So this is comes with all kinds of its quality problems and so on and so forth. Why? Well, because whatever we try to do today, think that we are doing foundational learning today. The effects of this foundational learning will be felt probably 20 years from now. So thinking about long-term strategies, even if we think of the best of them, will yield results much, much later. So we know that what we have now is something that will determine short-term, and so we should understand that and see what we can do to support these processes. Okay, and so if one wants to answer some question like that, so this is an old lens. This is the lens where people look at levels of education completions, right? Whether you finished university, you finished school. You can also ask, about the quality of education, right? And while all educationists actually like to think that education really matters for the growing economy, for economic prosperity, actually the evidence linking human capital to income at the macro level, at the level of a country, is actually very weak. Okay? Now, this is the paradox, because actually, if you look at the literature on the connection between Indians or human capital and their incomes, this evidence is, it's more satisfying in sense that, we get it for every year of education a child has, or an adult has, they get 10 to 15% income higher. So that kind of suggests to us that there is something, that some meaningful content to. But when we look at it at a macro level, yeah, the result seems to be fairly weak. And to just show that, I'm going to show you a table where you don't need to read anything. All you need to look at is this red bar and look at those numbers, and you will see a bunch of negative, and you will see absence of stars, which signify statistical significance. Okay, this is a very seminal paper by a famous education economist called Land Pritchett, who basically, in a very provocative paper saying, where has all the education gone, took a large sample of countries and looked across them, and they had different levels of education, right, completion, and found that there is almost, even if you kind of control for lots of other things that are different across the countries, at the macro level, doesn't seem to be any connection between levels of completion of education levels and growth, right? And then someone said, well, it could be that these levels don't really come with quality, right? People are just going through these hoops. And he said, okay, let us now look at the connection between test scores that many countries collect and growth. And it's the same thing. You will see some numbers, but you won't see any statistical significance, right? So there doesn't seem to be a very robust connection between these macro indicators of human capital and growth and development, right? So this has spawned a large literature in trying to ask, why are we seeing this? Is this actually true? Because if it's true, then, we have been advocating education for improving the economy for a long time. Yeah, are we wrong in doing so? Or are there technical challenges that we need to face when we ask some questions like that? Okay. Now, some of these technical challenges are actually very trivial to understand. In fact, they're fairly general for us to understand, right? The estimates that you just saw are cross-country comparisons. So you're comparing the US to Serbia, to India, to Australia, and so on and so forth. Yes, you have a lot of controls in the statistical sense, but countries are too different. They are too different in their institutions, too different in the way they work. So maybe these kind of cross-country comparisons are not valid. So why you are seeing no connection is because you are comparing, apples to oranges or mangoes to lychees, as I say nowadays. There is another way, another correction you could do to thinking about these kind of problems. You could say, well, let's not compare across countries. Let's compare the country to itself over time, because education will go up or go down in some countries of the world, and maybe that causes fluctuations in growth rates, and that's where we will kind of learn whether education matters or not. Okay, this has got to do with something I taught some of you in the workshop with the idea of a panel regression, but these are often very bad to actually estimate impacts of very slow moving things. Why? Education levels, talk of educated people in India is not going to go up in a big way year on year or even 5 years, right? It takes a long time to see substantial changes in education completions in a society to be able to, to get enough variation over time for a country to be able to estimate its relationship, right? And so, at the end of it, these kind of exercises have also not yield amazing results. And so the verdict from the literature, almost 15 years of literature on this, is that we still need to compare across space, but we cannot compare countries. We need to compare within much smaller spaces, right? And what are these smaller spaces? These are things like we compare across states, but even states have different policies. We can compare across districts, look at their completion rates, look at their growth rates. We could even go down to blocks. We could go down even to villages, right? And this is a literature that is, I call the macro-micro literature. It is not about individuals. It's still about societies, right? About economies. A village is an economy in itself. And so you're doing kind of macro kind of work, but of course the level is not a country, but the level is a much more disaggregated unit. So what are the challenges? And I like to say this because often when social scientists present, our talk seems to be much more general. Whenever I've gone, my uncle used to be a scientist. Whenever I sat, they would always present very technical stuff. And I used to always say that, why do social scientists only have to talk about general things? So I'm going to talk about something slightly technical, but actually it's so easy to understand that you can almost say it's a general thing, right? Which is that, does education cause income increases, or does income cause high education? You can say that people like to get educated when they get richer. They want to send their children to universities. Countries invest a lot more in higher education once they go richer. You could think about the process working in the opposite way, right? So you become rich and then you invest in education. It would give you very similar rates of, similar correlations over time. So that's one problem that all research which tries to look at these relationships have to deal with. The second relationship is education in a society is highly linked with lots and lots of things which we call institutions. This word institutions is like a catch-all for a lot of things that we know are different, like practices, law and order, savings behavior. Generally educated societies are quote unquote more functional in some ways, right? And it's very difficult to figure out, to get data on that or to measure those dimensions. So when you see educated societies doing better, how do you know it's the education and not the fact that, the judiciary is fairly good, law and order works very well? All those could also have independent impacts on growth. So these are two important problems that all research in this field have to take in. So with this general thing, I'd like to talk about, some research on India that kind of establishes some things, or so we think. Notice that, and this is important, that one of the disadvantages of being in the global south is that when we present research, we are kind of thought to be like, okay, developed countries have the money, they have the education, research is on them. It's a kind of an exotic thing to look at some developing countries. The term development economics itself, as I point out many times, is a figment of that, where study of a whole country or a whole part of the world is put into one field. So, but this kind of literature actually tells you that, in fact, you should be looking at individual countries, because too broad comparisons give you results which don't make sense. Okay, so India is not just because you like and you live in India, it's also a strategy to be able to understand this relationship. So what do we know about the connection between education and growth at various levels of disaggregation for a country like India, right? So I put this regression table because I wanted to show you some other results which I think are very stark. So these S's stand for the share of population that have completed and only completed that level only, and nothing higher. So S of Pri is the share of the adult labor force that has only primary education and nothing above that, right? The S Sec is the share of population which has just matriculation, nothing above that. And S Tert is tertiary education, is the share of population that has university education completion. Okay. Notice that the only one which has some AB written on it, which is a journal way of writing stars, I get, significance. The only significant correlate of growth in states of India across time, in fact, this is a panel regression, is higher education completion. Okay. Now that doesn't mean, of course, that that school education doesn't matter. You don't get people completing university if they haven't gone to primary school. But it tells you that for getting, if you have an economics lens and you want to think about education, it's only when you can get people all the way up to university, that's where you get dividends from education, right? And in fact, if you in a society, if you have in Indian society, if you have a 1% change in graduate completion among matriculates, it has the same effect as a 13% decrease in illiteracy. So why do I point out this stark thing? Because one way you can do education policies, you can have mass education, and then you hope that some people will reach different levels of education, right? But there are other policies you can think of in the short run where you take matriculates and try to increase conversion rates to universities. And that would give you a lot more. Of course, 1% change in graduate education is a harder thing because the base is very small. We are looking here, as I said, in 2001, it was 5% of Indian adults actually had university education. So 1% change is a very big change if you think of in that sense. But there is a margin on which some things can be done, right? And if you look at the last column, which tells you about a conversion rate. So the last column, just to interpret that, this is the proportion of people who are at least higher secondary, who then go on to complete graduation. This is about a 50%. Okay, it has gone up slightly over the last few years, but we are losing half our children from higher secondary to university. Okay. Now, if you can do something about it, there will be a short-run effect. You can try to change short-run things. So when we think about these lenses, yes, foundational learning is important. Yes, it's important to start from very low down. But a policy which kind of gets people into school and then forgets about them, leading to a large proportion of people with some level of schooling, is not very useful from an economics lens. Note, I'm using the word economics lens because you can say that education is a thing that you desire by itself. And I don't think one can deny that. Educated individuals make up better societies. But if you're thinking about investments in education, you have to think like an economist. So you have to think in some sense about the return from it, right? Further, if you drill down to where this connection between higher education, or between this level of university completion is with the economy, it's not in the primary sector. It's not in the manufacturing sector. It's only in the services sector. Okay? So the story is that university completion has a connection with growth, but it's largely to the services sector. Right? This is actually not true for all countries in the world. China showed about 30 years of growth just by focusing on middle schooling because they had a very strong manufacturing-driven, story. Right? So depending on what kind of economy you have, different levels of education will have a role. Okay, so that was state. Maybe states are very different. Maybe states are, too broad to compare. They have different state policies. Why don't we drill down further, right? Why don't we drill down to districts of India? And this particular graph basically shows you the dispersion of university education across different districts of India. Okay, you can see there's a fair degree of variation even within a particular state. Of course, once you drill down to districts, it gets harder to measure things like development, right? States, because of budgets, declares, SDPs, you have good measures of what progress means, or at least economic progress means. So one of the things I urge many students to do is to think out of the box. And so about 14 years back, researchers in the US realized by looking at data all over the world that nightlights has a very, very strong correlation to economic growth and development, right? Now, is nightlights growth? Of course not. It's a proxy, right? But it has a very strong link. And so the advantage is once you think about nightlights as your measure of development, you are freed of the statistical system. Now you look at satellites. Okay, So a lot of research now in economics is using satellite data. And once you have satellite data, it's all you have to do is you observe things from space, you observe night lights, you observe crop productivity, you observe infrastructure, and then to kind of construct district level numbers is just about geospatially clipping kind of boundaries to say, well, in this part of this district, this is the night lights. And so you can see the figure on the right basically is just converting this image into an average nightlight luminosity for each district of India. Okay, so if you are asking a harder question, you have to be more innovative. You cannot come back and say, well, we don't have data, and you can do actually even better than this, as you will see in a bit. If you move down to districts, this correlation is equally strong. So this is the share of population above 25 with tertiary education on the x-axis, and the luminosity per square kilometer on the y-axis, and you'll see that there is a kind of a very positive kind of shape. This will, of course, be confirmed with statistical kind of testing. Statistical tests. Even before that, you can see there's a strong positive correlation between the two. But we have to again now deal with this fact that, well, those 2 points we talked about, which causes what do we do about institutions? One good thing about looking at districts of India is that if you look at intra-state comparisons, which is districts within a state, they have the same state policies. So at least you are not picking up impacts of state policies, differences across different states. You are looking at different districts within the same state. Okay, so many things are the same for them, which makes comparisons tighter, which makes you give more quote-unquote causal results. Okay, so as we have been talking in the workshop, the name of the game you can think of it like an experiment, is to generate what is called exogenous variation in higher education, like changes in higher education that are not because of income, not because of institutions, but just happen that there are differences across different districts. And then you ask, well, if there is some variation in that, if there are differences in that, does it cause higher levels of development? Okay, so that's the kind of nature of experiment you are thinking. You cannot use the differences that are there in the data across different education levels across districts, because of course they also react to income, they also react to other institutions that we have talked about. So this is where the role that a lot of us economists play in experimental work is to think about natural experiments that yield such answers. So here's one just for fun's sake. This is a map of the Catholic missions in 1911. This is actually from the Vatican, this map. And while you cannot see it, you will see that there are some parts that are marked in red and marked. So this is where Catholics kind of settle down in by the end of the beginning of the 20th century. And as I pointed out in our workshop too, a lot of Catholic missions in India are Jesuit. Okay? Jesuits have a very, very strong preference for higher education. Okay? But Jesuits, in the history of Jesuits, say that they have very little role to play in almost any other institution of India. They don't change agriculture practices. They have relatively less to do with how you trade. Christians are not a big population, part of the population of India. So in an experiment like this, of course, there are many more details. One can think about, well, is it the case that where Catholic missions basically organized and set up shop, by the early 20th century, are these places now that you see higher levels of education, right? And that is true. And that's amazingly true. And actually that's true for Protestants too. Places where Protestants set up show on an average higher literacy rates. They always focused on lower levels of education. Okay? The point here is not to explain what determines higher education, but to think about experiments which give you variation, which is not linked to income. So of course you have to establish that Catholic missionaries did not set up in rich places, didn't set up in good places, which would have seen anyways progress over time, right? So that's the part of the experiment. That's the part of of arguing these cases. So a lot of students, I would encourage you to learn a lot of GIS methods. You can convert a lot of old stuff, old maps, a lot of stuff that geographers do into data that economists can use. This is the same missionary map juxtaposed on current boundaries, district boundaries of India. Okay? So you can figure where they are. right away. And that was just to give you a kind of an idea of what an experiment means. At the end of it, if you do it, you see the results that you get from the state level basically borne out again at the district level. The only level of education completion that matters for, you know, economic development proxied by nightlights is again higher education. Uh, Primary education completions, other things don't have any correlation, right? Again, this is not to say primary education is not important. You don't get university completion, hawa mein. You still have to go through primary. It is to say that a policy of just getting children to school and then forgetting about them is not going to get you any economic growth, right? Not going to get you economic development. They will just complete a level and just drop out, and that is not going to give you anything that you can use. Okay, very similar to state level results. The only thing that seems to matter why it has this connection to growth is the tertiary GDP, which is again just like the services sector. Okay, so it's again the service sector kind of higher education, service sector growth kind of link that comes up in India. So now many of you may kind of think that, oh, this is the confirmation. You are in Hyderabad, right? You see all these, you know, all these universities, these schools. You have IT parks. Everyone is thinking, okay, so tertiary, of course, service sector. You know, we are providing financial services. We are providing IT services. This is the story of India that we always want to tell, right? What sort of activities do people do? University educated people do in terms of these what we call services, right? So yeah, if you look at the share of what tertiary educated 25 and above do, yes, it's services. You can see that 48% of people who are university educated are in the services sector, so that's not surprising. But what in services sector? I call it the great Indian education multiplier. A large proportion of people in university educated people in India are in education. Okay, it's of course disproportionately large for females, but it's not small for males either, right? Now those who have done, I mean Naresh here, we have done many village studies. We know that getting a sarkari naukri in school is a big thing. You know, it's not a small job. It's a lucrative job, right? So I think what we need to ask ourselves is that, yes, we have this great connection. Yes, we have all these criticisms that our public schools are not working, teachers are not doing anything. We need to investigate this further, because if this is the source of growth or part of it, then what is it about education, what is it about teachers that is leading us to this link, right? Note, I am also aware of a very perverse relationship which asks us to question the concept of GDP itself. If you measure GDP from the income side, and a big proportion of them are public servants like teachers, and their wages are determined by the government, then those wages have nothing to do with their productivity. So you might be getting a higher GDP because of large proportions of people in education, but that's just an accounting thing, that because they get higher wages, so it shows up in GDP, and so GDP goes up, right? But I'm a little more, I'm less pessimistic. I do think teachers have a very important role to play. I will talk about it quickly later, but it is true that this is a link that, you know, people don't talk about enough. They're only thinking about IT parks and financial investments when they're thinking about the educated in India, right? So the second theme I want to quickly talk about in the old lens is this idea that, you know, we have a link of higher education to the service sector, to the, you know, to the growth of a country. This is a structural transformation kind. It's consistent with the structural transformation story, right? And, you know, people have postulated over the years that higher education, people get educated, they'll move from the primary sector, typically agriculture, to the secondary and then to the tertiary. Maybe we skipped manufacturing, but, you know, we are moving in that direction. And typically, such movement comes with movement of labor from rural to urban areas. This is the classical kind of, you know, Lewis kind of idea. You know, there are many, many kind of grand models of thought that think about the process of urbanization with education and with the sectoral change. Okay, so if this is true, then you should see what you would generally see, that you see a rise in human capital, you see an increasing share of service sector, you see a rising urbanization, and this is basically what leads to growth and development. However, please content with the fact that according to the population census of 2011, approximately 1/3 of the tertiary educated actually reside in rural areas. Okay, and if I can show you, this is the proportion of the first four graphs are the proportion of the population living in rural areas that are university educated, and you can see that there's been a rise from about 1.68% in 1991 to about 6% in 2018. But the overall stock is, of course, includes a lot of older people, and you cannot change their education level. So let's look at the younger people, 25 to 34 years old, right? And you see this number has gone up from 2.67 to 12.28, right? These are rural residents. So what has remained, kind of unsaid in the story of higher education and this idea in our head of structural transformation is that, but we have a huge proportion of people with university education even in rural areas, right? So what are they doing there, right? And so you can ask this question, well, do they have a role to play in rural prosperity? This is important, and I'll talk about it very quickly in the end. This leads to a very different way societies will grow. Okay, and if indeed tertiary education has a role in rural prosperity, then what is it driven by? Is it driven by education? Is it driven by jobs inside, outside? Is it driven by agriculture? Is it driven by private jobs? All these things are important for us to think about in this particular link, right? You can even do better if you are doing work at the village level. In fact, you can now move down to a sub-district. In fact, in my paper with Ravinder, we moved down to the village and we asked whether the village prosperity has anything to do with the share of population who is university educated living in a village. Okay, and forget everything about this table except the fact that you see that numbers like 0.05, 0.04, these basically tell you that there's almost a 4 to 5% increase in log of consumption in village. So 5% increase in consumption, average consumption in villages where there are higher proportion of university educated, right? This is already addressing many of the problems that we have talked about. And so these are causal estimates of that nature. So the importance is then, where is this coming from, right? Is it coming from just these university, these education jobs of school teachers in villages? Actually, it increases the probability of regular jobs, but not in the public sector. In fact, private sector jobs, people tend to get more private sector jobs in villages once you have a higher university education. But that is not the surprising part. The surprising part, and I think the hope, for India moving forward, is having higher educated persons in a household causes agriculture output per unit of cultivated land to rise. In fact, skilled agriculture is now the second most reported occupation for tertiary educated in a village, right? Now, I know university educated people do not want to do farming. I'm not in any delusion that everyone wants to be an agriculturalist. However, you can think about many of the problems that urban India is facing, in terms of it's very difficult to migrate, there are not enough jobs for university educated persons. We hear about university people being Uber drivers. There is a margin here where you can get growth in the rural sector because university educated people now will live there. So where do we get this from? We find in further investigation that having such members means that you have access to technology. You have information about technology. You have information about prices, right? These households are more likely to move into more mechanization. They have higher crop diversification, right? So where is this coming from? Well, you have an educated person in the household. Whether the person himself or herself is interested or not, you now actually can say, Papa, look at this mobile phone में आपको दिखा देते हैं कहाँ पे क्या चल रहा है, right? यहाँ पे आपको agriculture institute है. You can get seeds from here. So there is a impact that you can get from here, and you can even get it from people being skilled agriculturalists themselves. So I call it the second wave in some sense. That, by the way, this, it's not just house reported. Even if you measure from space, you can measure greenery, and you can kind of try to figure out whether that's agriculture productivity or not. It shows exactly the same result. So it's not some reporting of agriculture profits. It's actually, you can even see it from space, that areas where you have these highly educated people staying actually show larger net, what is called net primary product. So the structural transformation story that we have come up with, right? More education, people will move out of villages, go to urban cities will get congested. Yeah, some of it is happening. But another thing is happening, which is that, it's a different kind of structural transformation. It doesn't rely on long-term migration flows. It's generated from within rural economies itself, right? And actually some people, including some Nobel Prize winners, have pointed out that we cannot forget the role of agriculture. We cannot wish away agriculture. Agriculture will still have an important role to play, but we have been struggling on how to get productivity increases. Maybe this is one way that we can. Evidence shows that it's already happening. Yeah, and maybe we need to bolster these processes. Okay, so that's my old lens to the problem. You can see that I've given you facts. You can position them differently and come up with your own narrative, a different look at this. But these facts remain, and whatever story you have to address these facts. So what are these new lenses, right? And so these new lenses are, so far if you see in all these things, we have talked about education levels, test scores, learning assessments. These are your proxies for human capital, right? Now, as an educationist, I've always known that these are imperfect. I don't really care so much about who gets what marks. But they have been popular because there is an idea that these are very good predictors of economic success, right? So, people have proxied for cognitive learning, sometimes ability, and they've found that these matter for earnings of individuals, right? And so from here, there has been this overall idea that all economic policy has to be, or education policy that is linked to economic factors, have to be about exams, assessments, and cognitive learning as being the pillar of what we want from our human capital, right? And so the formal education boards do that. You can see even the way we measure learning assessments, ASAR, it's all about cognitive learning. But in a very interesting experiment that was done by these two authors, Hoff and Pandey, they did this following experiment. They basically put randomly in two groups. They put, there are two groups, basically, they're put in different rooms. In one group, names of everyone was read out, which indicated their caste. Okay? And the other group, no announcement was made. So these two groups had people from different castes, including people from marginalized castes. The result was that in the group where the names were announced, lower caste students performed much poorly than people from more privileged castes, right? In the other group, where there was no announcement, there was almost no difference. So then ask yourself, if we are going to base education policy on assessment, then we have to recognize that assessments are not just cognitive ability. They are also about your identity. They're also about your personality. And in fact, this was pointed out by Heckman in a seminal piece. And basically he said that, we are obsessing about just increasing people's assessment scores. But actually assessment scores are not as kind of standard, that other things don't matter for it. It matters who you are. It matters how people are evaluating you. It matters what you think of yourself in society, right? So should we also then try to think about these other aspects? Maybe they need to be buttressed for us to get something out of our education system. So why focus only on cognitive ability? And he gave a very I find this a very, very interesting example in the US, right? In the US, when you fail your high school, you're allowed to take an exam called the GED, okay? At the end of the GED, the scores you get are exactly equivalent to what, so if you have got 80% in the GED, that's like getting 80% in the high school scores, okay? So at the end of the GED, pretty much you are equivalent to the person who passed high school. So let's compare people who passed high school but didn't go to college to GED who didn't go to college, right? And who got very similar scores. Now, cognitively, they should be exactly the same. They have the exact same learning, right? But All you need to know is that the light bar chart is the outcome for those who completed high secondary, right, passed it the first time, but no college. And the black one is basically the GED guys who failed, but then did the GED, got equivalent scores, and then didn't study college. So the thing to notice is that the outcomes are wildly different, and the outcomes are, you control for ability, you control for, other personality traits and stuff like that. You can see that this is the annual earnings. I can show it to you for almost all life outcomes. So cognitively, they are no different. But there is something different about people who have failed, right? That it seems to, in fact, have a strong predictive power on many other things that matter to economists, and not just economists, to sociologists, people who work on crime, all these other dimensions. So his point was, why do we need to focus only on this education aspect as if that's the holy grail and nothing else matters, right? And so with this new understanding in the last 10 years, there has been an explosion in what you mean by human capital. There is a recognition now that we need to, cognitive skills, just cognitive skills of learning assessment are not necessary. For to get economic success, you need reasoning, logical reasoning, curiosity, self-regulation, and you need a bunch of non-cognitive skills too, which we thought was outside the ambit of economic research, but which psychologists work on. Sociability, grit, confidence, being interesting, aspects of personality, things like that, right? And now, so these matter, and these people have been tracking for now some years in developed countries. You can see that the only thing you need to notice here is the top kind of line, which represents the amount of jobs that people do in high social skill, high math activities. These are the skills, these are the jobs that are going up in the developed world, represented by the US, right? In fact, you can see the one that is at the bottom are jobs which are low social, low math. That doesn't work. But if you try to compensate and look at the red line, these are high social, low math, you'll see that's also doing quite well. Okay? And if you look at earnings, in fact, in the developed world, the earnings are basically accruing to people who have some knowledge of math, but actually sociability, being able to work in teams, is equally important, if not in fact, you can see that the blue line, in some sense, the red line is almost higher than the blue line in many years. But you can say that, these are stories of the US and, Europe and things like that. Maybe they don't matter. But in fact, there is now lots of evidence that these are beginning to matter, and matter for developing countries as well, right? So one of the things I always wonder about, these are the returns, the earnings that you get at different levels of education in India. And you can see it's convex, right? At the top, it goes up by a lot. Ask yourself the following question. Leaving aside people from some elite institutions like University of Hyderabad and ISI and IIT and IIMs, who have never filled up a single survey form that I know of. I know very few people from these places who have ever filled an NSS survey form. What is being taught in universities that gives rise to such huge returns, right? I mean, what are being taught? Okay, maybe it's sorting, but is the evidence on sorting very high? No, not really. If you think about it, there are many students in India who are very, very smart, but who are not able to go to university because they don't have the money, right? So if anything, sorting is probably very, very imperfect in the Indian market, but we don't know as much. International evidence is, while we like to believe that there is sorting, this sorting is only for a very handful of institutions, most of whom don't count in most surveys. Harvard graduate is never part of a US survey. The evidence on cognitive learning is also very weak. I don't know what, we are all complaining universities are not teaching that much, what's not useful for the market. So what is the market paying for, right? And if you think of it like that, and now I'm being provocative, I don't know. There is some evidence that education institutions are actually places that people are building personalities, right? They are facing the world, making independent choice. They are getting influenced by peers on non-cognitive traits. Okay? And there is evidence, in fact, from Delhi University, no less, that this is true. Now, how big it is, what lingering impact it will have is an open question. The World Development Report, in fact, points out that technology is making some of the standard skills useless. So, in fact, you will need those skills that I mentioned if they're not important today, they will be important in the next 5 years. There's no way you can get away. So bottom line is that these are different kind of skills which are important, and the new education policy also recognizes that. Question is, but these are skills. Maybe they're traits. Yeah, interesting, sir. Some people are interesting, right? So how, maybe so telling someone who's not interesting, bhai interesting ban jao, may not be easy, right? But actually, there is now evidence that they can be changed when you are young. Yeah. Does it mean it's too late for college students? I don't know. We don't have any evidence. We don't know. I mean, there is no research on this. We have limited evidence on whether we can change whether we can make you interesting at this stage. But for sure, we know that when you are young, this is possible. Okay. One way to do this is through pedagogy, right? And a lot of research economists who work with educationists, and it's nice, I saw an education board here, that we are working with educationists to figure out how to change the pedagogy at scale to make students more inquisitive, more curious. Of course, there is this controversial, as it's called, tyranny of curriculum, right? You have to finish the syllabus. Actually, parents often think that there is a trade-off between, like very different innovative kind of thinking and exam scores, because they often say कि ये सब project कराते हैं ना, score कम हो जाता है. We want the children to do well in boards, right? This has important implications, because in public schools, if people are not going to do well, they will suffer even more. But I will show you some evidence. First, I will just talk about Turkey, then Uganda, and then some recent evidence on India, and that's the last thing I'll talk about. In a recent paper in the American Economic Review, in poor schools of Turkey, people found that you can prime students to become inquisitive. And science, sir, is a great tool for that, right? Children are naturally drawn towards scientific topics. But also the nature of, not just the topics, the nature of inquiry is a questioning inquiry. And that has spillovers on many other things. Okay? In Uganda, which by the way is very close to India in Human Development Index, so we are not too far from Uganda, the teachers are taught how to learn. So not what you need to learn, but how to learn, right? Which they then try to teach the students. And these are all randomized controlled trials which have found that in fact, not only does it increase people's learning, but it increases people's test scores, right? Lo and behold, this is what a lot of people in the old lens care about, right? One of the things that, we want to do this in, I call it Bharat, because, I want to talk about the part of India which is not your elite schools and elite, private schools and so on and so forth. I don't read this, but all of you know that it's in very bad shape. Lots of people are in school, but as I said, education levels are not very high. Teachers are reluctant, right, to change things. How do you give this kind of changes, this kind of pedagogy learnings in these things, in these kind of schools? Can you retrain teachers? The evidence on teacher training has been very poor in India. Okay? So we can't retrain teachers. Teachers will just say, no naukri milta hai, mera assessment hoga ki I can produce board results. I don't care if they are inquisitive or not. But we observe sometimes that one of the things that the Indian education system is dealing with, and that is true for university too actually, is that students are getting increasingly disengaged from curriculum. Okay, this is even more so in public schools where teachers are boring. They may be teaching right stuff, but they are boring, right? Or the pedagogy is boring, and many of them just get disengaged. In fact, the national sample survey asked people why they don't go to school, and the second most important reason was children are not interested. And many people thought it was an excuse. Surveyor ne aise hi bhar diya hai. He's not interested because they didn't want to answer. But if you take that seriously, then maybe we can do something about that aspect. Okay. So how do you do this at scale? Well, one of the things to understand modern way Indian modern states work. Nowadays, states don't implement. Nowadays, NGOs work with states to implement. And I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. There are people who are specialized in doing some things, and for activities that don't require very, very sustained effort, this may not be a bad idea. So let me give an example. I call it the Carl Sagan example. When I was in high school, we used to get 1 hour of a program on Sunday called Cosmos. right? By Carl Sagan. It was only 1 hour. He was not coming to my class every day to tell me, teach me science. But to stimulate my interest in science, to want me to learn and to engage with what is happening to class, it was kind of important that it raised my level of inquisitiveness and my interest in that particular subject to do so. So I am not a scientist, but I gained from it. So it obviously spilled over to other aspects of my pedagogy and my learning, right? So can we create Carl Sagans in public schools in India? And so we worked with an NGO, foundation that is actually trying to specialize in this. And this is not one small NGO. These are now big foundations that are working in many states of India, right? And so I'll just give you an example, and then I will end my talk. So there is a session on light. Typical teacher will go to the blackboard and draw angle of incidence, angle of reflection, something like that, refraction. And the students will be just throwing chalk at each other, and pastes on each other, and what is going on and stuff, right? So what does this pedagogy kind of idea do? It's a third party that is synchronized with the syllabus. Before starting of any topic, once every month, it basically goes and does experiments, right? And how does it do experiments? It goes in a mobile kind of, let me show this. Yeah, it takes basically, takes all these mobile vans, takes nice experiments. And this is where scientists actually have to play a very important role. How to construct these interesting experiments to get the interest of children, right? And so, for me, I will not go through the whole thing. For me as a child growing up, one of the most amazing things was to burn paper through a magnifying glass. It was a science at work, right? And you can make a drastic thing from a small thing. And if you engage children in various experiments, it is possible that they connect to the sessions that go on in light, right? So we did this randomized controlled trial exactly for that. And what do we see? This is UP. This is public schools. So we are not talking here about some hi-fi private school of Delhi or Hyderabad. We do find that this is able to increase scientific curiosity of children. Now, how do we measure this? We work with psychologists. So this is another field. So you can see the fields are all now getting, it's interdisciplinary. Educationists, economists, evaluators, psychologists, all come together. So we try to measure increased scientific curiosity, increases curiosity in general, increases creativity, which we measure through tasks, confidence, increases education aspirations, and if you don't care about all that, it increases scores in science and in some other subjects too, which are linked to science, like math, right? So maybe this is the way we should do. In fact, the Andhra government is also trying out something called the EMDP, which we are evaluating with 33,000 kids all over Andhra Pradesh. Again, to make children think out of the box. This doesn't have to be at the cost of what is going on. What is going on will keep going on. It will change in its own secular small way. It is to create a system with NGOs, with foundations outside to prop up this kind of thinking, which we think is going to complement what is done in schools and colleges. So when you come here, you will already be interesting. Yeah, you will not have to learn to be interesting in colleges, right? So in conclusion, I will say that it's important to take note of this aspect of human capital also, which is becoming increasingly important in the world, but not to accept them as traits, because a lot of people do. When you talk to someone and say he's impatient, bachpan se impatient hai, right? It's a trait, so you can't do anything about it. Yeah, risk-taking. He's a risk-taking person. I don't think even children understand what it means to be risk-taking. Risk-taking is not to take risk. It's to in some sense, to reduce the risk factor of risky things. That's what a smart entrepreneur does, right? So a country can invest in this, as we are seeing through many of these interventions. Now, how much? We still don't know. What is the return from this? We have some estimates, but this is left to many of you young researchers to tell us so that we can do it. So to completely sum, we need to be able to reap from our education institutions. Of course, we have to do something about the cognitive skills. What we are saying is something is already going on. It's not like education is useless, but we have to prop it up. But we have to bolster it with higher order skills and non-cognitive skills. It is possible. These are not like in the air kind of statements. The good news is, unlike private schools where everyone complains that project-based work, experiential learning work is in conflict with their children's SAT scores to go abroad or to apply for IIT, at the level of most students in India, especially in public schools, there is no conflict, right? Already it's very low. The only way you can do is to drag them mentally back to the class in some way, so that while we work on teaching practices and so on and so forth, the children at least are able to attach themselves back to the content. And this can only come through stimulating things like curiosity, way of asking, questioning, things like that, right? So there is no conflict. In fact, it may bolster these old outcomes that we care about. Thank you.
I want to make this session more interesting now, if possible. Actually, your data was fascinating, and I want to give my spin to it, if you don't mind. I'm not an economist. See, you were showing two important things. One, that even though in a system where education per se and higher education in particular has failed, higher education does pay dividends. This seems like an inversion anomaly at a larger level. A failed system, higher education, I'm using a strong word to make a case, is still paying a dividend. And therefore, we should go for higher gross enrollment ratio, because that's one tool that is available to us. Maybe it is paying dividends even in villages. That's what you showed. I think this is fascinating. But I think the inversion happens because we are talking about India, where we are fifth largest economy. It's a very large economy, and bulk of this economy comes from low income people. People who earn 25,000 per month make about 40, 50, 60% of GDP. This is the dark side. And any failed education also will give you 25,000, 30,000 per month. So this is reconciling the dark side. Our real job is to generate high income jobs. Anomaly, India has always been an anomaly. Fifth largest economy doesn't give high income jobs. Even when we become third largest economy, I'm doubtful whether we will generate high income enough jobs. So we are moving, but we are failing. So this is a real anomaly. So the real question is, how do we generate high income jobs to individuals? If we want to become a developed nation, our per capita GDP has to go at least tenfold. We are maybe $2,000 per year per person now, thereabouts. We should become $20,000. So it's a long jump we have to make. So at a base level, we are happy. At a base level, higher education is paying. But that base level is a base level. In fact, this is the real dark side. In the country with about maybe 800, 900 districts, only about 100 districts contribute to the best part of GDP. The remaining 600, 700 districts, some of them do not even contribute as much as Sudan districts. Districts in Sudan contribute. That belly, dark belly is very high. So we are an uneven happening country, and I think this data does fit with that. We have a long way to go. I'm talking like a general citizen, but I think my numbers are accurate enough in the economics model. So therefore, gross enrollment ratio has to happen, increase. Other way we'll be stuck. So there is a window of opportunity that if we do national education policy properly, gross enrollment ratio from about current 22, 23%, 25, it should go to at least 50%. Then there is a possibility that high income jobs will start happening, provided we become innovative. Before I came here, I was working with Agastya. The entire purpose of Agastya is to create innovation, out-of-box innovation, because classrooms in the schools, classrooms in the colleges, classrooms in the universities have become extremely boring for various reasons. So we have to have a different model where students ask out-of-box questions, sort of not so relevant questions sometimes, and then maybe that will trigger some level of deep learning, deep passion, curiosity, that you are using that word. And that should awaken innovation, which will create high paying jobs. Right now we are doing service jobs, only service jobs. We are not creating enough things. We are not creating good books. We don't write good books. We don't create good educational tools that others can follow. We are simply following what is there available. Very flat world. So if we start doing even in Infosys and Tata Consultancy Services, we are only services. No high technology has been created in India. Now it is happening. But in the past, simply following. It's a miserable situation. Innovation has not happened. Now it is happening. And other sordid story of India is excellence is there, but only 1%, 2%. I'll give best example. IITs, NITs in the country, if we take them as excellent engineering training institutions, annually they do not produce more than 40,000 students per year. All NITs, all IITs, all new IITs, everybody put together, about 40,000 or so. How many engineering graduates India produces per year? About 40 lakhs. In the 40 lakhs of ocean, 40,000 of excellence. It's a single digit. And this is so in every walk of life. We have miserably failed in scaling up the excellence. We have almost not used women power in most of our productive activities. Women power is just coming up now. 50% of human population in India has never been used properly. Unless we use that 50% very powerfully, very effectively, we will not get there. Impossible. No model will work. It would be very interesting to see tertiary educated females in villages, semi-urban and urban cities. If you look at their data, how do they contribute? That's an unsung story so far. My feeling is the moment we start unleashing women power in productive Indian activities, I think we will start seeing high-paying jobs. I don't think we have done that. So I think India is a very mixed bag country, uneven. Excellence is there, but in patches. And there is no uniformity at all. And there are dark patches at multiple locations in the country. Unless we develop this evenly, bring about methods where we evenly promote high-paying jobs, I think we will remain a work in progress. This is my, and I think all of us have responsibility to that. And also, we don't have too much time. Please remember, our demographic dividend is at a sweet spot. If we miss this opportunity, we may become an aging population with no productivity. Dangerous situation. At least Western countries who are aging have already developed their affluence. They have resources. They can hire manpower from India to get their things done. We should reach a situation within maybe 10 years where we generate high-paying jobs, increase our resources, so that when our country becomes aged, we have a breathing room. Otherwise, it will be very, very disastrous, in my opinion. So I think I'm just putting the context in relation to what you have presented. I think your data is just fascinating, but I can reconcile with that using Indian GDP as a benchmark. It's not a very happy scenario in the real sense, because our GDP, although big, but it's not even enough at all. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed and learned a lot. We need to promote Agastya type of models. We need a lot more of that. I think young scholars sitting here, I should go to the ground and set up some of these projects. These are not expensive projects at all. These are no money projects. Toy models. Using toys, we used to stimulate thinking in the students. It's possible to do it with very, very low resources. And those resources we can generate by CSRs. So if we can generate some of these interesting, pedagogic, stimulating models, I think the rural system will wake up. You don't need to send them to IITs, all of them. IIT is not a model for us to follow. It's a small model. 98% of bulk India is not in IIT, sorry. So I think we need to come up with our own models, which I hope our young scholars will contribute towards. Thank you very much. I think I spoke a little too much, but I think. Okay. Some questions can be, some tough questions have to be asked now. You know, it's a 1 o'clock, maybe 10, 15 minutes, 10 minutes. Please open up with some questions to our esteemed speaker, especially from students. Yes. We are all students, absolutely right. We are all students, young students, not so young students. You can shout or you need a mic? Shout. Shout. That's the best way.
Thank you, sir. I am Sravan, MA Economics second year student. Going through your first lens and second lens, my thought process is going like this. I am saying and then I can frame it as a question. While seeing your first lens, I was thinking like, okay, you said higher education gives more dividend, so we have to focus on tertiary education. But we need to have more base, right? More base to drag more people into higher education. So I was thinking like we have to put more interest towards primary education, because if you create more curiosity and more people who are curious enough to go towards higher education, then we have more enough base, so that even if you take smaller portion of people to tertiary education, then we have great dividends. But your second lens cleared the thought for me. But again, you said curiosity and test scores trade-off. So I was thinking again back, like if we create more higher education institutes which are so-called excellence, then this trade-off can decrease, so that we can focus more on creating curiosity. So there is some kind of balance we have to create between focusing towards primary and higher because, as I explained, both are intertwined. So what kind of balance we should?
Yeah.
That is one thing, and I had second question.
Let me try to answer that first thing first. Okay. All right. That's a great question. I just want to point out that there is, in fact, I said there is no trade-off. Okay. And that's important. If there was a trade-off, then we would have to do all these discussions about, test scores will go down if you do curiosity. But, a lot of times people misinterpret my results that I presented to begin with, saying that my results are saying that we should focus only on higher education. It's not. It is focusing on higher education completion. Okay. How do you get higher education completion? It can come in many ways, right? I talked about one way you could do it, and that one way I pointed out was because even if you were to raise curiosity of children in primary school, the impact of that on higher education would be 15 years from now, right? And as Honorable Vice Chancellor has pointed out, it may be too late then, right? So only in the spirit of that, I talked about whether, well, look, there is a margin here of higher secondary students. Can we do something about them? But you are completely correct that ultimate solutions have to come from a more robust primary education system. My submission is that pushing people into school to just increase enrollment ratios is not the solution to the problem. This has been actually the policy for the last about 30 years, right? It has also some positive benefits. I remember someone both of us know, Jean Drez, telling us that, you're talking about education returns, but look in these people when earlier they could not sign a debt contract, and today they can sign their name and ask you what are the terms, right? There is something about empowerment that comes through education. That's definitely true. But if you are looking for a funded education system, you also need to generate some output out of it. And that's why the economic lens is important, right? But if you invest in primary education, sure, you should. But the evidence so far has been, barring some of these very innovative procedures, we have not thought of it like that. I think the education policy does think. But to be honest, when I go outside these education spaces, even these education spaces, people are often poo-pooing at some newfangled ideas that educationists have had that, we should do experiential learning, we should do discovery-based learning. It's a new fads in education. But what people are not realizing is the crisis that education is in. And these innovative solutions are the only solutions that may actually revive the system, right? And I would also like to react to that. It's a great point that all the work that we have shown in these slides have been on incremental returns. There has not been, and so we have said this will get you more. There has never been a contention that this is getting you the perfect, that we are going to become a $1 trillion economy just by doing, what we are doing right now. It definitely needs bolstering. But one of the things I would like to tell you is that I submit is that there's a lot of recent mumbling. If you talk to, there are no surveys on this, but I talk to Uber drivers a lot. A lot of people you notice, they tell me, इतना पढ़ने का जरूरत क्या था? Uber driver ही बनना है तो. A lot of us miss that because of these high returns, there has been all households, all parents, they have this immediate idea that economic prosperity is equal to more education, is equal to sending people through different levels of education. This is not something that is true for all parts of the world. And my suspicion is that if the returns are not, are not equally distributed, then very soon people will say, why go to university? Uber driver banna hai to high secondary mein kaam pe lag jata hai. Right? We have taken a long time to move away from people working and going out to actually wanting to come and study. So that's an aspect that we should not, and in fact, education policy or policies that are targeted to funding should not treat education as elite spaces, but as a critical requirement for getting any benefit out of education, right? The other things that how to increase the levels, they will come from this propping up of primary schooling, making people curious, thinking about out of the box solutions and stuff. But that I would say is work in progress, right? So the first part, the old lens part, is telling you that, don't think of it like an elite thing, that, this is the, there are a bunch of people who are very privileged and they're going to universities and, that's what it is, right? And that is bolstered by a lot of students saying that, oh, they're learning nothing from university, koi kaam nahi aa raha naukri ke liye. I mean, I hear this a lot. And these go back to policymakers also, that university spaces are just sorting mechanism, nothing happening here, there's no real impact on the economy. Firms are complaining there are no skills. So everyone's asking, what is happening in university? It's useless place. People are just, sorting themselves. You get to IIT, you show that you're a good student. That's all. There's nothing happening in any institutions. But that is not true, because evidence is pointing out that there is something happening, right? So this is the important point, that these institutions, higher education institutions, do also have to be bolstered. Is it going to be enough? I completely submit. Of course not. And we have to work on these out-of-the-box solutions in the education, the schooling system, to make sure that not only we get, by the way, once that improves, it may well be that the returns to university education fall. Because then even a higher secondary educated person would have enough skills in a different way to be able to earn better learn. But the levels would go up at all levels. Levels would be higher for income, right? But we are very far away from that. So we need two-pronged strategies, and not just one-pronged, where we say that, so in the initial phase, India focused a lot on higher education. Then post 75, we have focused a lot on making education available to all. And that's good, because we have to do that. But I think somewhere we have kind of forgotten that it's also important that we just don't have a few IITs, but in fact, we try to make higher education salient for more and more people, right? And so that's an important thing that, I think that's my general point that I would like to make. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. I am sorry, it's not your results, but at least in the parents' mindset, there is the trade of exits, this thing. And the second question. Okay.
I can answer your second question outside.
You already said only students, but I have one question, simple question. In your experimental studies, you have mentioned that the social identity or identity of the individual has played an important role while getting the scores, basically, whereas other group did not face any kind of a problem. When social identity and or individual identity plays an important role in getting the scores, as well as in terms of the cognitive skills also, because Ashwini Deshpande studies proves that cognitive skills depends upon the social identity. How do you see that the level of the earnings depends only on the level of the education or the number of years of the schooling, basically, because all these are carried to the labor market also in terms of the social identity, because there are various studies even in the context of India also in terms of the occupational discrimination because of the social identities and the gender identities, wage discrimination. So what is the way forward you can look for it? Because we see from the primary schools to the secondary and the higher educations, identity is seen. Social identity plays an important role. We cannot hide, especially in the Indian context. Similarly, the case with the gender also. Now we are talking about the alternative gender also. So what is the way forward to have the better earnings even with social identities?
So, I mean, it's, to be honest, I could answer this for like next 1 hour, but I think that, I wanted to make a different point. Okay. So the fact that there is discrimination in the labor market based on, identity, caste identity, gender identity, this is fairly well known. Okay. It's been known for many years. It's not just India. It's everywhere in the world. This is a universal phenomenon. But I'm actually pointing out to an even more subtle point, if I can. I don't know if it's subtle, but the fact that these identities play through. So let's say that a firm does not discriminate. The firm just wants to hire people who have lots of marks, right? 99% wale ko hire karna hai. I'm pointing out that these identities are already affecting so even if you give the same input, the same teacher, the same school, the same library infrastructure, in which there is also discrimination. Let's say we are able to do that. That's easier. Government policy says everyone should have a school, everyone should have a library, everyone should have, just spend money on that. What we are pointing out is that identity interacts with your own assessments in a way that even if the firm does not discriminate and we're using only your assessment as a way of rewarding you, it would still be in some sense discriminating, right? And in so far as that is there, we have to realize that these identity, these learnings, these cognitive things which we take as, so I think a lot of us, if we said there's no discrimination, but we only discriminate on cognitive ability, I think meritocracy society, a lot of people think that's fine, right? Okay, we don't use any caste identity, we will not use gender identity, we'll use your scores. My point is that even then, you are in fact, you have this discrimination because how people take scores even with the same inputs depends on who is looking at you, who's evaluating you. So these are much more subtle. And these are happening all the time in India. And in fact, we should think about, these are about other aspects of you, which are, almost psychological, if you can say that, right? Which needs to be also addressed in public schools. It's not just a matter of, that we have given you the same input, so you should be doing the same output. If you don't, then you are lazy, or your, parental education is the only thing that matters. Yes, it matters, but it also matters on how you perceive yourself as a person, on your own confidence, on what you think you can do, and how people are evaluating you. And I think that we have not thought about it. Researchers have talked about it. Sociologists have talked a lot about it. But I think that we, as a policy on how to address some of these issues, we have not. And we are still a big believer in meritocracy. And we feel that as long as we can only evaluate by your grades, we are being completely fair. Even that is not fair, is my point. Thank you.
I think that was a very good lecture. Thank you for that. But my question is around, say, work of CODS, who compares what happened to wages and salaries of workers before 70s and after 70s. I was just thinking that your data set begins from 80s and then works towards, I think, the more current period. But suppose you pick on data between, say, 50s and 80s, would we have the same results? And the reason why I'm asking is because there the interpretation is that, and which actually works down to the ground, that there is an intensification of informalization. You made through the course of your lecture one point, which is, say, for instance, those who are recruited in the government, are they really productive if we really take those incomes and believe that, so it may not hold. The same thing might hold true to a large number of these poor people who are migrants, who are recruited to informal employment, that their productivity levels could be high, while their incomes are very poor, not because they are less skilled, because most of that is about on-job training and learning by doing, but because perhaps they are unorganized, because perhaps there's no civic voice that stands by. And the second question comes in the backdrop of the budget and its allocations, which have gone down in the, so I was just wondering, when our Vice Chancellor said that as part of the NEP, we need greater enrollment. If you enroll large number of people and the per capita fund actually goes down, we might become like the government schools. So your comment on both.
No, so very, very, very good questions. So the first thing is, I showed you some graphs because, I didn't want to just talk. Actually, the state paper that shows the link between higher education and growth is using a data set from 1950s onwards, 50s to 2000 actually, because the paper was written about 10 years back. And those results are still true, but the time series is long. So it's not like we use only recent data. But what you point out is interesting. One of the things we notice is that till the mid-1960s or 70s, we see that levels of education like secondary, they did matter for GDPs, okay? Even primary to some extent. But that's because we were an agrarian economy, right? So farmer knows how to read and write, you will get some productivity increase. And this has been well documented in works on Green Revolution and so on and so forth. But post 80s, you don't see this anymore. In fact, the interesting thing is when I studied my graduate coursework, we used to learn that returns to education are concave. The incremental returns, they're the highest when you move from illiteracy to primary education. And then as you move towards higher levels, the incremental amount that you get goes down. But that is only a phenomenon. It's not just India, all over the world. It's the 1980s. Post 1980s, the returns to education in almost every country, barring the US, because in the US, the only relevant education level that differentiates people is higher education, is convex, which means that there is something in the change in the production structure of the world that actually now rewards university completion much more than what used to in the. So there is, so answering your question on whether there's a change in the way these results should be looked, yes, there is a change, right? There is a change, and that's got to do with the primacy of which sector that you're looking in. The second point you raise is much more fundamental. The second point is, I think, it got to do with whether wages reflect productivity or not. Okay, the empirical evidence on that overall is mixed. People have tried models of looking at bargaining solutions, that there are unions, whether you actually for the same work, whether you get higher wages or not. People have tried to evaluate whether informal sector people definitely get lower wages or not. Put to econometric tests, the results are, I would say, not as firm as we think they are, but I'm sure that for many sectors that is true. Now, whether that, so if you believe that, then you come from the income side or even the consumption side on GDP, then we have to start asking if GDP is a relevant number or not, right? So then what is the metric? If you use consumption, it will also be subject to the same bias. So there has to be some way of evaluating this. So I take your claim, it may be true, but it's very hard to figure out what does it mean to be productive but not getting income, and what is its impact on the macro economy. It's easy to say that at the individual level, but what is that impact of that on the macro economy? I think it's a harder thing to measure. So I do not know. I mean, I acknowledge your point, but I have less to say on that. It's a possibility that then we have to look at all these standard things that we use to evaluate success, prosperity, and so on and so forth. On the last point, I think that yes, and I think higher education, and one of the reasons why I make these presentations is I feel that there is a increased idea that higher education is a very elite thing, and especially if you are going to be a low value economy, which we are, we should focus only on a few places to produce growth, and the rest, they can have good schooling, that is enough. I don't think that is true, and I think that that narrative has built up over time, and it's built over time because education systems are very unequal for a long time, right? And I think that it's time to kind of also, with these results, tell the government that, look, you also have to put money in, get people, but you have to put money in because higher education is an important part. It is just not an elitist concept that, that people should go to universities. And a lot of people tell me that, why should people go to universities? In the US, people don't. Bill Gates was a Harvard dropout. Bill Gates is a classic example. Harvard dropout. He did well. He completed companies. No, I think we need to think beyond Bill Gates. So he did, yeah.
So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm here for giving vote of thanks, and I'm really happy to give vote of thanks. Honorable Vice Chancellor Professor B.J. Rao on the stage, along with today's speaker, Professor Abhiroop Mukhopadhyay, the Dean of School of Economics, Professor R. Vijay, and colleagues and students. On behalf of the School of Economics, I want to express my deepest gratitude to Vice Chancellor, Professor B.J. Rao, for chairing this Golden Jubilee second distinguished lecture. Thank you very much, sir. And I also thank for your interventions, which are very useful to understand the lecture in deepest manner. I would also like to thank Professor Abhiroop Mukhopadhyay for his thought-provoking lecture on human capital in India, lenses old and new. And this is important in the sense that we have been thinking about the human development in Indian context for the very long period, and mostly we were thinking about increasing the educational levels across the social groups, across the states, across the rural and urban areas. But we need to come up with some more better policy initiatives in Indian context. So I request Professor Abhiroop to accept our sincere thanks for your valuable contributions by giving this particular lecture on the human development in India. And we hope to have a pleasure of welcoming you again in the future and look forward to more knowledge sharing opportunities. Uh, uh, I would also like to thank the IOE Directorate and Professor Gansham Krishna for their generous support in funding this particular event. Adding to this, thanks to the Office of PRO, the state section, Buffalo Media for live streaming the event. And finally, I thank you to the faculties, Office of the School of Economics, students, and audience for being here and contributing to the success of this lecture. Thank you very much. So, thank you very much, everyone, for being here.